Okay, let's take a couple of minutes of focusing a point on the floor. And just be the mirror, reflecting what's ever taking place. It can't be very difficult as a practice to experience as it is. So however your experience is what you're experiencing. If the correct practice is experiencing whatever you're experiencing, you can't go wrong. You can't do it wrong, because whatever the experience is, that's the experience. Okay, relax. Any last minute questions from the last session? Anything that popped in your mind that you wanted to clarify? No new topics, but just anything from the last. So we're going to go into a new topic. Okay. In original Buddhism, what I mean original is the first of the Buddhist teachings in Pali, that the Buddha talked about the cessation or the ending of suffering. He also talked about the secondary consciousness, and he talked about that consciousness ceasing, meaning that our consciousness ceases, and that's nirvana. Many people then took a nihilistic interpretation, and when the Buddha talked about a candle burning, and nirvana is like blowing out the candle, the flame is finished. He would say, people say, well, where do you go when you attain nirvana? And he says, where does the flame go? When you blow it out, where's the flame? So many, perhaps most, took that as a nihilistic concept of extinction of consciousness. They didn't differentiate and see that there is consciousness, this secondary consciousness, that can cease, and in its cessation, in its ceasing, something else is exposed, nirvana, which is a consciousness of sorts. It's empty, it's aware, it doesn't exist as a substance. It's not concrete. It doesn't continue. Just like space doesn't continue. We can't say space continues. What's continuing? There's nothing there that's continuing in time. So that's what is then referred to in the Dzogchen teachings as Rigpa. Rigpa is nirvana. That's that consciousness that's always present and is recognized clearly when the secondary consciousness ceases. So an example that's been used often in explaining this aspect by people that understood it is, imagine in a river or in an ocean a whirlpool swirling, and the water swirling around and going down. We can consider ourselves as a localization in an ocean of consciousness. Our localization is like an individual whirlpool swirling. And this whirlpool that's swirling is like the secondary consciousness, in consciousness. It's the movement of clear, empty space, like a whirlpool. The energy is moving. And for a consciousness that's in that experience, that's our experience of consciousness as an individual localized consciousness. And the way this is taught in the original early Theravadan teachings is that cessation is when the whirlpool slows down more and more and more, like the mind, slows down more and more and more, and the whirlpool is no longer whirling, and there's just ocean. So when the whirlpool ceases, the whirlpool is just ocean, whirling. When the whirling ceases, there's just ocean, but no whirling. There's no localization anymore. The localization was the whirlpool. So our secondary consciousness is a whirling, like the whirlpool. When it ceases, there's just primordial consciousness. So it's not, where does the whirlpool go? How does the whirlpool get to nirvana? Where does the whirlpool go when it ceases whirling? What happens to us? If our sense of self is the whirlpool, what happens to us when the whirlpool ceases? Where do we go? There's no we. There's no one going anywhere. The whirlpool has ceased. There's just ocean. That's nirvana. Some take it to where the whirlpool ceases, that's the end of all consciousness, extinction. But that's erring on the side of nihilism. If we go on the other side and we say the whirlpool is eternal, that would be the typical Hindu Vedic interpretation of the Atman being eternal. Some may have that interpretation. That's erring on the side of eternalism. That something is this soul-like consciousness, this whirlpool of localization, of individuality, is eternal. It continues forever. Our soul is eternal. But the soul, the localization, is only a whirling of energy. And when that whirling ceases, that's the same as if we have a jar full of water and I have some dirt in it and I shake it up and I'm whirling it. And the dirty muck that's in the jar, if this was consciousness, this would be a confused, mucky consciousness. If we hold the jar perfectly still, after a time all of that settles to the bottom and the water is crystal clear. Crystal clear. That's Rigpa. Just crystal clear. That's all Rigpa is. It's crystal clear. Yeah.
So what, you're taking a little bit of the world from one life to another if you're believing in
It's the whirling that's going from one lifetime to a lifetime. Mm-hmm. It's a momentum in the energy body, in the consciousness. So at death, as an example, when death occurs, and when you go to sleep, every time you go to sleep at night, there's a moment when the whirling ceases. And at death, for a moment, there's just no whirling. It's that transition between falling asleep and going into the dream state. There's what's a Tibetan word called bardo, which means a transitional state, in between states. That bardo occurs every time you just fall asleep. There's a moment of what we call the clear light, where there's no whirling. And then in the next moment, the whirling starts again in a dream. We go into a dream state. At death, the same things happens. The whirling ceases for just a moment, and we experience the clear light of Rigpa. But because of the momentum of the whirling, it starts again. Because that consciousness hasn't seen the nature of its own emptiness. And so the whirling persists. Bill?
The secondary consciousness, would that be what mediums and people of that ability contact in seances, in mediumship? Is that the secondary part of a secondary consciousness, an energy that they're able to relate to or see, to maybe help others here on earth that are suffering with their loss or that energetic loss?
It makes sense to me.
Okay. It's cleared up a lot for me, you know, because I've experienced a lot of mediumship throughout my years, and I believe that there's something, but I never knew what it would be called.
Right. So there's an energy field that's around this sphere of energy. The very center of that energy field, of that consciousness, is Rigpa. That's the center, and its energy field is around it and interpenetrating. I don't want to go too much into that because this is something you just need to experience for yourself. Otherwise you start building structures in your mind of what Rigpa and its consciousness with rings and so forth.
But it's not Rigpa that goes from lifetime to lifetime.
It's not conscious, it's not wisdom. It's an occluded Rigpa, so to speak. Although the Rigpa itself has never been tainted. But again, if we try to really mechanically take this thing apart, it doesn't work real well because we're combining two systems. We're talking Chinese and Russian at the same time. making half the sentence Chinese and half the sentence Russian, which would be the language of Rigpa, non-conceptuality, and are conceptualizing what this thing looks like to our conceptual mind. And it's just like it's inconceivable, although you can make models, and then you get stuck in all of more whirling in these projections. So this whirling in the traditional Buddhist teachings is our sense of identity. And it's empty. As we discover when the whirling ceases, and we say, well, where did I go? You were the whirling. Everything about you, the identity, that was this whirling. When the whirling ceases, everything about that conscious identity is the same as when you go to sleep at night and you're in a dream and you're this person in the dream and you wake up in the morning. Where did I go? The person I was in the dream when I woke up. Where did I go? Because in the dream you were a self-sufficient, autonomous entity in your experience. When you wake up in the morning, that identity vanishes, and you may have still a lingering feeling about it. If it was a scary dream, you might wake up a little bit afraid. A carryover of that identity. But ultimately, where did that identity go? Where is it? It's gone. It never was anything. It was empty. It was always just empty activity of the mind that had no central core to it. So when we wake up in the morning, that identity, that dreamed identity of secondary consciousness ceases. The whirlpool of the dream entity ceased. So we can't say where that entity is now. Where is the identity, that person, that entity I was in my dream? Where is it now? Don't tell me it just ceased. It had to go somewhere. Something had to continue. Where is it now? It isn't. It ceased. Likewise, our consciousness now, our identity, our sense of self, historically, my self-image from my childhood and who I am, that sense of identity in realization ceases. And that's what the Buddha was talking about. Cessation of the whirlpool. It ceases. So people would ask him, where do I go then? Do I go to nirvana? It's a meaningless question. Do I go to nirvana? There is no I. There's just nirvana, because the individual localization dissolved. There's no continuation of something. So, when we are asleep at night having a dream and we are this personality, this identity in the dream, when we wake up, it's gone. But we don't notice, when we wake up in the morning, the subconscious isn't done making its entity identities. It starts projecting the identity that you're experiencing right now of who you think and feel you are. That's a subconscious projection. It is no more real than the projection that you had when you were dreaming of being this entity in the dream. It's a projection of the subconscious. The subconscious is creating this entity from thought. And that's the person you are in your dream. When you wake up in the morning, you think you're no longer that dream entity. You're not. But it's not being noticed that the subconscious is creating a new identity based on history and conditioning. And that's what you inhabit, not noticing that it's a subconscious projection. So when we do certain practices, looking into the emptiness of self, looking into the nature of the whirlpool, and seeing where is there a self, an actual substantive self in this whirlpool that gives the feeling of self, the subconscious projection of this whirlpool, where in that is the actual self. And when the whirlpool slows down more and more and ceases, we see clearly there never was a self in there. The feeling of self is the whirlpooling. When the whirlpooling ceases, the sensation of self is no longer. What there is Rigpa. which is a sense of beingness that can't be defined in terms of self or identity. It's something that's non-conceptual. So, what can happen and what needs to happen for all of us is just like when your mind sees a piece of rope on the floor thinking it's a snake, and we turn the lights up, and all of a sudden the idea of snake is seen to be ridiculous. The mind was superimposing upon this form of the rope and labeling it snake with all of the representations and meaning of what snake means, what we've learned about a snake, is now projected on that rope. When we turn the lights on, the mind no longer sees snake at all, and all of the associations with snake and the adrenaline we feel, all of that immediately ceases. Likewise in our mind, when our subconscious mind that's projecting this sense of self, it's seeing, experiencing the body and the mind, the secondary consciousness, and it's labeling that, not snake, but me. So instead of saying the mind-body, which is like a piece of rope, instead of labeling and saying, oh, that's a snake, the subconscious mind saying, oh, that's a me, that's a self. I am that. That's what I am, that's my identity. So the subconscious now has this identity that's associated with the physical form and the mind, self-image. From conditioning from childhood, this self-image I have is myself. That's what the subconscious is projecting. If we can turn up the lights enough, the subconscious sees that the body and the mind is a body of mind, a whirlpool swirling with no self in there anywhere other than a bunch of thoughts, empty thoughts about a self, and the subconscious will see that and stop projecting me. Stop projecting the identity of a me. Just like when you wake up in the morning, the dream identity, the subconscious ceases projecting it. Or even when you're in a dream at night and you start saying, wait a second, this is too strange. I must be dreaming this. And you wake up. You realize you're in a projection. You realize you're in a dream projection. And the subconscious at that moment ceases the projection and you wake up in your bed. And you go, oh, that was cool. I recognized in my dream that I was dreaming. So likewise, our consciousness now, the mind, certain things can take place in the mind, in the subconscious as well, to where the subconscious goes, oh, and it ceases projecting this feeling of self, this feeling of me, which is identical to your condition before you were 2 years old. The subconscious was not projecting a me thought yet. So to a person that's less than 18 months to 2 years old, the subconscious is not projecting a me identity. That organism, that mind-body, doesn't have a thing called a me. It's not being created yet. If we could somehow talk to that child intelligently with concepts and say, could you describe to me your sense of self, your me, what that is? It would be like, there isn't one. I have no, that's not in here, that doesn't compute. Because it's not part of consciousness yet, it's not there. So likewise, in Rigpa, the subconscious mind has ceased projecting the me, the self-identity, and there's just an absence of self. But there's still full consciousness, just like when you were a baby. So it's not like something is missing other than what was just an add-on, a piece of software that got added on. So this self that we think we are, that we're living, my self-image of who I am, that's just a projection of the subconscious. So what we have to do, there's a few ways to address this, and one of the ways is to be exploring this topic of no self, which was the total message of the Buddha. Is in the Pali language, it was called anatta. Anatta means no self. and this was one of the pillars of the Buddha's teachings, is this self that supposedly in samsara doesn't exist. It's a projection of mind. And so we have to position ourselves in such a way that our mind bodies are exposed to the information that causes the subconscious to see the error of its ways, and it ceases, creating snake over a piece of rope, creating a me identity over a body-mind. The body-mind is the rope in this case. So one of the things I've recommended many times, because it's easy and I'm too lazy to do it all myself, is this group online called Liberation Unleashed. That group has skilled people who can enter a dialogue with you. And you say, yeah, I have this sense of self, I'd like to see through it. They say, great, let's walk through that together. And they have you look at different aspects. And what does happen, shallow or deep, with individuals, and you can read all the dialogues, this happens. The subconscious ceases, and all of a sudden there's a wow moment. There never was a self. It was completely a projection of my own mind. And all of those dialogues are recorded there and saved, and you can read through them. They also have a book of many of these dialogues. Somebody who contacted them for the first time, it's all done by email, back and forth. And you can read these dialogues talking about that. So we'll do a little bit of, I will dialogue with all of you, and we'll go into this. But I recommend all of you go to that website, Liberation Unleashed, and download their free book. It's like 250 pages, and it's all case histories. Peter, George, Sharon, all of these different people from beginning to end. And sometimes it goes for weeks. It doesn't mean that it's that long, but that they got back to the person a few days later. They were given some questions to ponder. What did you find in doing these things? And it seems to be extremely helpful. For some people it's an intellectual understanding, but it made a shift in their consciousness. Something happened in the subconscious, and there was an opening, a space, where the whirlpool ceased for that moment. And they experienced this absence of a self, a me, which is simply a projection of mind. You will have no success in your spiritual quest until the emptiness of the self-personal identity is seen to be empty, just like the thought marmalade. It won't happen. All of these traditions, and this will be in my book, Way of Light, I will describe in each one of those traditions how the central pillar of all of those traditions is seeing through the false mental subconscious projection of personal identity. Each one of them, Sufism, Kabbalah, Orthodox Christianity, Dzogchen, Taoism, you name it, that result in a body of light phenomena as the end. That's the hallmark. When I was interviewing the head rabbi of the Lubavitcher Hasidic sect in Israel a few years ago, I had an opportunity to have a private interview with him, and we talked about these topics. And I said that I had met with this at another Kabbalah center, which are around the world called Kabbalah centers. Madonna got involved in that and gave them a bunch of money. And they had a little bit different view. The head of their group drove a Rolls Royce and this sort of stuff, this rabbi. And I said, you know, it seems that because they sold all kinds of stuff, hats and T-shirts and Kabbalah jewelry and all of this stuff in their gift shops and stuff. I said, it seems, this was before I met with this rabbi I was talking to you about. Their head rabbi was in Jerusalem, or Tel Aviv, was Rabbi Meyer. And I met with him from the Kabbalah centers. And I said, it seems that people are very ego-motivated here. And he said, yes, it seems that way, but we realize that God creates the ego to be able to enjoy those ego things that people acquire through the ego. And that God can't have that enjoyment of all of those ego things unless the ego is inhabited and lived. The enjoyments of being in ego consciousness. And at first I go, oh, that is really cool. I never thought of it that way. Consciousness is creating the ego so that it can have the ego experience. And so it's okay to be egocentric and selfish and do all of that because God wants to experience those experiences of selfishness and all that goes along with possessiveness and control and all of that suffering. I see. Okay, I get it. That's interesting. And I'm thinking, this is really weird. There's something just not right with this. There's something, because nothing in Kabbalah talks like that. Nothing. But this was this rabbi's insight. And why, of course, it became so popular. Bring your ego. Bring it in. We're not going to have you get beyond your ego. Your ego is a gift from God. It's God's way of experiencing everything. So, human ego loves this one. So, anyway, so it was a few days later, I had this opportunity to meet with this real rabbi, whose master did have the body of light experience, his teacher in Tel Aviv. And I said, you know, it was interesting. I was visiting the Kabbalah Center, and we were talking about this, and I told him what Rabbi Meyer said to me, and he just shook his head. He said, using these words, his words, he said, the clear light of consciousness, when the ego is present in this clear light consciousness, that clear light consciousness is opaque. It's not clear and transparent. It has substance still within its content. And the Hebrew word is betul. Betul means the disappearance of ego, the annihilation of ego, the absence of ego is betul. It's a very important teaching in Kabbalah and Hasidic Judaism and mysticism. Betul is like what it's all about, anatta, the illusion of personal selfhood. And so he said, as long as that ego is in the center of consciousness, you don't experience transparency. If you don't experience transparency, you don't know the nature of God. You only know the nature of ego, that which is present there. So that, of course, made sense because it went along with all of the other teachings. Went along with Buddhism and went along with Sufism, and we can go into these. And these will be discussions I'll have in this other book, The Way of Light. I'll take each tradition and explain each of them and how they correlate and what their core teachings are and how they're similar to each other, and being able to do that. So that gives you some further insight into the nature of this content, this ego thought, this subconscious projection. And it's not that blocks Rigpa. It's just that's the experience that Rigpa is having, because that's what's there in consciousness. So Rigpa is just kind of like experiencing its own content. When its content is ego consciousness, that's the experience. It doesn't mean that Rigpa is not Rigpa. It's just in the experience of ego consciousness as an experience. Like a dream, a daydream. And that's why I use the example of daydream all the time. Everything that's going on in what we call samsaric consciousness is a daydream. So whenever you catch yourself in a daydream, that's what's going on. You are in a secondary consciousness. In Rigpa, there's no daydream taking place. You're just in a clear state of awareness. So what we have to do is expose the subconscious mind to enough information until all of a sudden it gets it and the whirlpool ceases and we're just finding ourselves in a condition like we were before at 18 to 24 months where there's no ego consciousness there. That baby or toddler isn't in Rigpa, but is in just a clear state of egoless awareness. We come to that same state again that many of the teachers have referred to, that state of being like a baby, being like a child. And then we observe what that consciousness is, that simple non-ego consciousness. And we observe the nature of that. That's Rigpa. Being aware of the qualities and the attributes of that consciousness that's appearing to just be a naked and aware state, being able to do that. So the way we're going to enter into this, first of all, is by, right now, we'll make a little bit of a position with your body, a little bit more posture correct. Let's close our eyes. And try to invoke or incite a feeling of me, a feeling of self, a feeling of personal identity. Sometimes if you think of something when you were embarrassed or somebody offended you, the main thing is to get this feeling of me. They can't talk to me this way. Or what is Jackson talking about? There's no me. I am me. However you can get it, get that sense of me. Just like you had the image of the dog in your mind, this time get that feeling of me, a personal self, self-image. Your feeling of who you are, your personality. I'm going to look around the room, keep your eyes closed. As you get a sense of that feeling of me, raise your hand like we did with the dog. Okay. Everybody put their hands down. Continue to observe that feeling of me. Now notice the awareness that's experiencing this feeling of me. The me is the mental event, it's the content. Now notice the awareness that that content is arising within. The observing awareness that's able to experience the me feeling, at which point the me feeling is no longer the subject of who you are, it's a mental object appearing in your consciousness. So again, get the feeling of me, the self feeling. And now observe the awareness that's aware of the me feeling. Just like we did with the dog. It's just another dog. With all kinds of associations, memories connected with it. Notice the me feeling again. The mental event is the feeling of me. And now the awareness of that event. Bring your attention back to what's aware of that feeling of me. And notice they're not the same. The me is just a thought, just a feeling, thought. I, me. It's just feeling a little more intimate than the dog. The me feeling is more your center. The dog was more like fringe. But the me feeling is just like the dog, but it's more central, more intimate to your consciousness. But now just notice the awareness that's aware of the me feeling, and that they're not the same. The awareness of the me feeling is not the me feeling. Rigpa is the awareness of the me feeling. The me feeling is secondary consciousness, the content. Again, bring back the me feeling. I. And now observe the awareness that's aware of the me feeling. Recognize you're the awareness that's aware of the me feeling. And that awareness has no me feeling other than this content. So as the me feeling dissolves, there's no other me feeling there. There's just presence of awareness. Now notice where the me feeling seems to be in your body. Again, notice the me feeling and the thought me. And recognize it's empty, like any other thought. It's like a transparent cloud that appears in the sky of your consciousness. It has no substance, it has no core. It's just a movement of the mind. The thought me, the thought I, the feeling me. And recognize it's as empty as the dog. Now focus on the awareness that's aware of the me feeling. Bring your attention to the awareness, putting no attention on the me feeling. And notice what's happening to the me feeling as you bring your attention to the awareness of the me feeling. The me feeling is just a thought in your consciousness. You didn't have this thought before you were 24 months old. It just arose in your mind. It's a story like a daydream, and it's empty. And your awareness that's aware of this me feeling is like the space in which the me feeling is arising and dissolving. There's no me there. There's no personal self.